Working Cows Podcast, episode 305. This episode is brought to you by Understanding Ag.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. This is Clay Connery, host of the Working Cows Podcast, recorded exclusively in the C90 Ocean Minerals Studios. And this episode is brought to you by Understanding Ag. Back with another Friday episode for Understanding Ag, and talking today with Gabe Brown and Alan Williams. And we're going to talk about matching your management to your context and making sure that you're not just applying good ideas that you found other places, even though they don't fit your context. And specifically, this episode was inspired by a conversation that Gabe and I had way back when we hatched this plan to partner together on producing some content, specifically using content and ideas that Understanding Ag promotes and teaches. And I was pitching to him the idea that I was going to use a twice over rotation, and he said, you know, I don't think in our context that will do much good. In fact, I think it will probably select for shallow-rooted, cool season species, and that's, if anything, we don't need more of that in my part of the world. So we're going to talk to them about matching context to your environment and matching management and context so that you are increasing diversity in some of those things. So, Gabe, Alan, thanks for joining me today on the Working Cows Podcast. Welcome back.
Thank you. It's good to be with you, Clay.
Absolutely. Great to be here this morning.
So Gabe and I sat down and started hatching these plans for this cooperative effort that we've been venturing on over the last few months, and it's been a great opportunity. I really have appreciated the opportunity to open the Understanding Ag network of instructors up to this audience, and really have had some profitable discussions. But one of the things that he said in the course of that was that I was talking to him about my grazing plans for this summer, and I was going to try to do a twice over rotation. And Gabe said something about twice over rotations in this part of the world, I think specifically, would tend to select for a shallower rooted plant. And did I understand that statement correctly, Gabe?
Yes, you did, Clay. And my reason for saying that is, you know, we're in an environment here in the Northern Plains where we have approximately 120 frost-free days. So we're limited a bit, both in our growing season and as you get into our environment, central, western part of the Dakotas, into Montana, Wyoming, etc., limited by moisture also. So if you're in a twice over system, there's just not enough growing days and moisture to allow those plants adequate time for recovery and rest. And because of that, they're not going to be able to develop that extensive deep root system that's needed to build resiliency into the system. And that's one of the issues that we have when we get into more prescriptive type of grazing regimes, is that we tend to narrow diversity. And when you're in an environment such as ours, that is dominated by cool season species, you're going to select even more so for those species that can tolerate extensive grazing and are such that they have the ability to just put on a seed head very quickly then. And that becomes just a survival tactic of those plants. And you'll see that over time in these systems.
So let's talk a little bit more about that cool season versus warm season thing. And I in my understanding, that is as much a function, Alan, of when the moisture comes as it is what's in the seed bank. I think a lot of those, or when the moisture's still useful in the ground, maybe is a better way to say it. But I think a lot of those plants are probably present in most seed banks or in many seed banks, but the moisture isn't there, or the plant roots aren't able to use the moisture at that time because it's already been used up by other things, and the water holding capacity isn't what it should be for those warm season plants to grow in our neighborhood. Would you agree with that?
Well, yes, but there's quite a few other factors that are going to influence it as well. It's inescapable, Clay, that we cannot get beyond the three rules of adaptive stewardship. The rule of compounding, the rule of diversity, and the rule of disruption. And whenever we ignore any of those three or all of those three, then we're really going to get in trouble. And we're going to do exactly as Gabe has said. We're going to narrow species diversity. We're going to narrow productivity. And we're going to actually start harming the biological functioning of that soil, which includes what you just said, the ability of that soil to be able to infiltrate and retain water, during critical periods of the year. So what we often see happening there is that, warm season perennials really do require a very high level of biological activity in the soil, particularly fungal activity in the soil and protozoal activity to thrive. And when we implement prescriptive grazing seasons that diminish fungal presence and protozoal presence in the soil and start to collapse that aggregate, that's when a lot of these cool seasons, seem to just sort of take over and become a lot more dominant in that system. And the other thing we have to look at is always go back to historical ecological context. Why are the vast majority of those cool seasons that exist there today and in many of these areas there? They were brought over. You're talking about smooth brome and a whole host of other things that are not native and that were imported from Europe. And what it boils down to is that those earlier grazers made the exact same mistakes. Okay. They tried to be prescriptive just like they were in Europe. And by doing so, rather than being adaptive, they grazed out the warm seasons that had existed there for literally millennia and had supported huge herds of bison, elk, antelope, and so forth, for a very, very long time. And in grazing that out, they said, well, we can go back to what we were using in Europe. So they started introducing all of these, European varieties, and that led us down the primrose path, to where we are today, basically.
Yeah, I think one of the dominant plants in our neighborhood is crested wheat, and I think the full name of that is Russian crested wheat, if I'm not mistaken. So it came from somewhere else, and it's one of those things that is really hard to get ahead of. It kind of does its thing early enough that everything else is it's hard to get anything else started in its place. So it's kind of goes back to what you're saying there. Let's talk a little bit more about something that Gabe also mentioned. There is the idea of resiliency and what we're building into these systems when we take a more adaptive approach rather than prescriptive approach, and we'd like to get there as well. But let's talk a little bit more about resiliency and kind of what we're accomplishing as we start to build resiliency.
Resiliency is critical, Clay, and I would say that out of all the things that we have done very wrong over the last several decades, that has been to not foster, facilitate, and build resiliency, but to actually do the opposite. We have taken away much of the resiliency that used to exist on our plains and our prairies and our grasslands. And prescriptive grazing systems, no matter what they are, you can trot them all out, okay? But any prescriptive grazing system is over time going to lower and damage resiliency, period. You cannot escape it. Now, but here's where people often go wrong initially with this. They make an initial change. Okay, say they've been grazing more continuously or set stock, and then they switch to a twice over. And they see a bump because the twice over is a disruption from the continuous or set stock grazing. So they see an initial benefit. And then in their mind, they say, oh, wow, this worked. I saw a benefit here. So now I'm going to do it this way every time. And so I'm going to always do a twice over because this worked this year. That's when they immediately have begun to start redamaging resiliency once again, because they made a change. They became non-prescriptive initially, but then they turned that particular grazing application into a prescription, and then once again started down the same path of decreasing resiliency, decreasing diversity, decreasing biology in the soil.
I would like to add a little bit about resiliency. And key to building resiliency in any of our agroecosystems is building those soil aggregates to a deeper depth of soil profile. You know, Alan and I began to tell you the number of times that we've been told, oh, you don't understand, our soils aren't like that. But yet, Clay, if I would poll 100 farmers or ranchers, I would doubt more than 3 of them could tell me how a soil aggregate is formed. Yet it's the most important thing in any farming or ranching operation to their economic viability. As we implement adaptive grazing principles and rules and use those practices, we build soil aggregation to a much deeper depth. If we're able to do that, we get more water infiltration, and we obviously increase carbon content of the soil. And importantly, to expand on what Alan just talked about, we see increased numbers of fungal and protozoa activity to deeper depths. That gives you resiliency. The past 3 years were the driest 3 years ever recorded at Bismarck, North Dakota, in a row. Driest 3 years. Yet on our ranch, we never had to destock at all. We were able to produce enough forage for all of our livestock during that 3-year period. We harvested a cash crop each of those 3 years, where my neighbors only harvested 1 out of the 3 years. And what's the difference? The difference is the resiliency in the soil. The difference is that aggregation to depth. So how many farmers and ranchers have really taken a spade and gone out and looked at the aggregation at 1 foot depth of profile, 2 feet, 3 feet? You know, hate to go more than that because it's getting into too much work to dig that deep, but but fact of the matter is, as we implement the rules of adaptive grazing, we're going to increase our rooting depth, and that leads directly to resiliency. That makes us very resilient for these wide swings in temperature and moisture. That's just critical to understand.
So, Gabe, if I can, I think you've mentioned that multiple times, that if you polled 100 farmers, 3 of them might be able to explain how a soil aggregate is formed. So maybe this is a venue where we should talk about how a soil aggregate is formed, just in brief, and I'm sure we'll dive into this deeper in a future episode, but I think that might be good.
So very, very briefly, one of the beautiful things about regenerative agriculture and these principles, rules, processes is they're the same anywhere in the world where there's land-based agriculture, where we can implement them. And simply put, building a soil aggregate is all about sand, silt, and clay particles. All landforms have sand, silt, and clay, just in different variations, proportions, fractions thereof. Binding those sand, silt, and clay particles with biological glues and glomalin, which is secreted by the mycorrhizal fungi that Ellen talked about. So all we need to do is understand we need diversity of growing plants to capture that solar energy, to pump that liquid carbon, as Dr. Christine Jones dubbed it, into the soil to attract biology. And we need that diversity of plant species so that we can feed that biology a diverse array of these carbon compounds. That's going to provide us then with those biotic glues. And you'll see those sand, silt, and clay particles binding together with biotic glues, with glomalin for mycorrhizal fungi, along the sheaths, the rhizosheaths of those plants. If you pull up a plant, look at the roots, you're going to see those new soil aggregates being formed along that rhizosheath. And a soil aggregate will only last approximately 4 weeks. And then biology consumes those carbon compounds that are holding them together, and you need to build new ones. Yet how many farmers and ranchers really pay attention to that? And it's so critical to their profitability. You know, this really isn't very complicated, Clay. Sand, silt, and clay held together by biotic glues. Simple as that.
And so the opposite of that is that the sand, silt, and clay is not held together, and it is probably, the way I understand it, would be compacted, and you can't infiltrate water and those things.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. It's think of when the municipality builds a new road. What do? They go disc that up. Why? To destroy the soil aggregates, which will compact that area to make for a stable bed to lay that road material on. Okay. Well, if we don't have living plants cycling that solar energy, we're not going to build soil aggregates. We're going to have very compacted soils. And that's the reason why oftentimes you see even a half-inch rainfall, you see water running off, sheet erosion off the soil surface rather than that water infiltrating. Too many producers think, woe is me. I haven't had enough rain. I'm in a drought. Well, you probably can't infiltrate the water you get anyway. So you better concentrate on building those aggregates first, and then you can complain that you don't have enough rainfall.
Right. Yep. We just had a 4 to 7 inch rain, depending on where you were standing in our neighborhood a couple weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago now. And the people who were paying attention, I heard them say it right. I got to keep the first 2. After that, the dams were filling, which was fine. It was the first time I've had water in my dam for 3 years, so I was happy. But it is.
And let me just ask, Clay, over how long a time frame did that 4 to 7 inches?
3 days. It was 2 or
3
3
days.
Yeah.
So, in all honesty, every drop should have infiltrated.
Yeah.
It should have. That's not that heavy of a rainfall event.
Right.
And so the beautiful thing is to get a rainfall event like that over a 3-day period. And then if your stock dams are still dry, that's a good thing. If it means it went into the soil profile. And then what you'll find is 2 to 3 days later, they'll start to fill up from underneath as that water moves through the soil profile.
Yeah, if I can borrow the colloquialism, my red pill moment was Shannon Sims sharing that their plan was to dry their stock dams up because the water wasn't running off, and then fill them from the bottom. And that was 6 years ago now, almost probably, and it just blew my mind to think about that. And here I am, gonna making steps towards that journey. Now, I don't know if I'll ever get my stock dam to that point because most of my water comes from my neighbor's place. But it is a goal of mine for sure to hold on to every drop I got. And I think by the time this releases, I'll have an episode coming out in the near future with a guy who was in a severe drought in southwest Nebraska, and they ended up, I think he said they've had 10 inches in the last 3 weeks. And he said, we still haven't run any water. So let's talk a little bit about what makes it adaptive. What is it that makes it adaptive? What are we actually doing to adapt to our current situations and scenarios, Alan?
So, again, to be truly adaptive, and I know I may sound like a broken record, but we have to go back to the 3 rules of adaptive stewardship. We first and foremost have to realize that every single thing we do creates compounding effects that then cascade. And those compounding effects are never neutral. They're either positive or negative, right? So that's the first rule is just simply what I would call a realization rule, right? That does occur. And the second rule is the rule of diversity. That's self-explanatory. The more diversity that we can have, the better everything is going to function, from beneath the soil to above the soil, period. But where the rubber meets the road for true adaptive grazing and adaptive management is in the third rule, the rule of disruption. Yeah, and that's where we have to understand that, there's multiple disruptive events that we can introduce on a year in, year out basis that allow us to be continuously adaptive, allow us to make continuous positive incremental progress, and allow us to be able to do exactly as we've been talking about, significantly build that soil aggregate, build the diversity of what's growing there, build the productivity, the biomass production, build the phytonutrient profile that is in what all of our livestock are eating, and hence the ultimate phytonutrient profile in the end product foods that we are consuming. Yeah, it also builds habitat, for all of the other creatures in the ecosystem that we want to exist and work for us out there, from beneficial insects and pollinators to birds to many other wildlife species. So when we look at the rule of disruption, and I invite everybody listening to go to our website at understandingag.com. We've got a lot of information in our articles and so forth there about the rule of disruption. But I'll just name a few, and we can talk about them a little bit here. One is altering stock density. That is really, really important. Way too many people in their much more prescriptive grazing practices are essentially putting about the same stock density per acre on the same acre year in and year out. They're not altering that at all. I also refer to it as pulsing of stock density, but we want to intentionally alter that stock density. Another one is alter rest period. Gabe talked about this earlier. Rest is so critical. And the honest truth is, Clay, it doesn't matter whether you're in a semi-arid or arid environment or in a much more temperate environment like I am in Mississippi and Alabama, where we do get a lot more moisture. We still need much more rest than the average grazer provides to be able to have the diversity that we really want and the function that we want. Another is alter paddock configuration. Just the mere shape of that paddock can significantly alter the actual biological and fertility impact that you get. It can alter the trample impact. For instance, a long, narrow paddock is going to give me a lot more trample impact, and fertility and biological impact than a square paddock, even with the same stock density, the same acres, the same duration. Okay. Paddock direction, altering paddock direction. Contour grazing is another disruption. Too many people fail to follow contours in setting up and grazing their paddocks. This allows you to actually move biology and move biological hotspots and expand those hotspots. You can do leader follower, multi-species. Bale grazing is a disruption. Planned burns, but you've got to be careful, very careful, not to overdo burning. Too many people do that. And we can have combinations thereof. So I can actually combine multiple disruptions into the same event. For instance, I can alter stock density, I can alter paddock configuration, and I can alter rest after that grazing event into a single grazing disruption. But the key here, Clay, is to never pick any one or two of these disruptions and then always implement just that disruption. Now you have once again become prescriptive. But one thing I do want to talk about, and I'm going to talk about it from the perspective of my country, and I'm going to ask Gabe to talk about it from the perspective of his country, and we'll talk about across North America. But this rest period, okay, way too many people in the eastern portion of the U.S., because we do typically get more moisture, are on anywhere from a 20 to a 40-day rotation period. Yeah, so they're only providing a recovery and rest period of 20 to 40 days during the active grazing season between these grazing events. And look, that's not long enough, even in our country. Okay, what you'll see is a significant narrowing of plant species diversity. You will see a collapse of the soil aggregate. You will see roots become more and more shallow rather than reaching deeper into the soil. You will lose forage biomass productivity. You will lose the phytonutrient benefit, and you'll lose ecosystem diversity as well. So there's a whole host of things that don't happen. We have found that if we want to significantly build all of those things I just listed, even in our country, in the eastern U.S., you really need to be thinking about extending rest periods to 60, 80, 90 days, and sometimes even beyond. We'll have pastures that we may rest for 6 months or longer from time to time, to be able to add more diversity. So now I'm going to ask Gabe to talk about, more semi-arid and arid environments and what we need to do there.
Sure, Alan. And for all the reasons that you mentioned, the same holds true in arid and semi-arid environments. Here in central North Dakota, where I'm at, we typically get around 17, 18 inches of total precipitation a year, although it hasn't been that lately. But even with that much precipitation, we need to extend rest periods much longer and recovery periods much longer than most think is necessary. Many decades ago, when I started down this path, I started with a twice over system. We were grazing a paddock twice, typically during the grazing season. Now realize back then, I was probably feeding hay for 5 months out of the year, so it was only about a 7-month grazing period. What I found was just what you said, a narrowing of species diversity. We were losing our soil aggregation. We were less resilient to drought. We were losing biodiversity, certainly. And so I started to extend the grazing season. And what we have now is, again, not a set formula as how often we graze, but typically we're grazing a paddock once every 12 to 15 months, okay? However, in saying that, we will use disruption. There are a number of paddocks each year. We will defer grazing to almost once every 2 years. And then those are the first paddocks that we graze. We'll actually have on those paddocks in May and early June. And that allows us that disruption. What we're finding is a significant increase in biodiversity, a significant increase in soil aggregation. And I know what many people are thinking, well, I'd go broke if I only graze the pasture once every 12 to 15 months. No, not true at all, because we're actually able to increase stock densities then significantly. So our net profit per acre increases significantly, even though we're giving those longer recovery and rest periods. I really think as you get into drier environments, I have a good friend in very eastern Montana, they're in a 10 to 12 inch moisture environment. he's grazing approximately once every 22 to 24 months. And I've actually been on his ranch and stood in warm season grasses over 6 feet tall. And I just shake my head because you usually don't see that. I think of Fernando Falamer and Alejandro Carrillo in the Chihuahuan Desert, 6 to 8 inch moisture environments. And Alan, you and I have both stood on those ranches in forage that's taller than we are. And it's absolutely amazing. But it all goes back to giving plants that opportunity to fully recover. And I want to say one other thing. So often people think of rest and recovery time as simply days on a calendar. But remember, where we're at in the Northern Hemisphere, we have to think of it more as growing days, right? Because up here, plants will typically shut down by mid-October and won't start up again until the following April, or depending when the snow leaves. And so those plants are not truly recovering at that time, during that time frame. So we can't just look at it as days on a calendar. We have to look at it as growing days.
I think that one of the things that I could hear somebody saying in response to all of this is kind of what you brought up, Gabe. But I've got a couple of examples of how that's not necessarily true. And I'd like you guys to maybe add more. And that is the balance between economics and soil health. Like you said, I'd go broke if I only grazed once every 12 to 14 months. But you've already shared with us that you guys didn't destock over the last 3 years, and you got a cash crop each of those 3 years in the lowest rainfall on record. And then also you talked about the increasing stock density and stocking rate that you're able to achieve on those same number of acres as a result of these things. So there's two arguments against that whole I would go broke, or the balance between economics and soil health, And so are there other examples that you can think of that would go against that?
Well, I'll just add another one that to me has meant probably more to our bottom line than anything else. I talked about how decades ago I used to feed hay for approximately 5 months. Well, 2 years ago, we fed hay a total of 18 days. Okay. That's a big difference. Now, this past winter, we had snow that came in October. We had to start feeding cows in December, and we fed them through March. That's the longest we've fed hay in the past 10 years. But think of the dollar savings in depreciation and fuel and labor and wear and tear on equipment and just doing the chores, feeding those animals every day. Think of the health benefits to the animals being out grazing. And then I'll turn it over to Ellen to talk about the epigenetic effects, because now we have built a cow herd that, my goal, I always joke to people, is I want our cows to be able to winter on a rock pile. If they can winter on a rock pile, they're making me money. Alan, do you want to talk about the epigenetic effects?
Real quick, it's not like you just said, Gabe, it's not just the cost of the hay, it's the cost of the feeding that we tend to overlook. Like, writing the check for the hay stinks, but then we forget about the fact that we've got all these other connected things that go along with getting that hay out to that cow.
Yeah, absolutely. And, when we do feed hay, we bale graze all the time. Even this past winter, we had over 120 inches of snow this past winter. Our cows were out bale grazing. Yeah, we were feeding hay, but they were using their 4 legs. They had to get out and get through those drifts, get to the bales. And there was actually times where they were eating down to the bales because the snow was packed so hard. But think of the dollar savings there. Think of the savings. I used to start 2 tractors every day, loader tractor, the feeder wagon. I'm like, man, oh man, oh man. It's no wonder my banker sent me a Christmas card every year.
Yeah. Epigenetics, Alan, tell me about that.
Yeah. And before I jump into that, let me just make a comment here. So from a pure economic standpoint, when is the worst time of the year to be running a tractor? In the winter, right? I mean, you're going to have the most wear and tear on that tractor. You know, you're going to have a lot of depreciation. You're going to have repair and maintenance, everything else. I mean, it's just the absolute worst time of the year to be running equipment, because it just absolutely, whether it's in Gabe's country and you're in deep snow, or it's my country and you're deep mud, you know, you're tearing the crap out of your equipment, as well as tearing the crap in my country out of your land, right? So we have to think about that as well. And by the way, Clay, if I've got somebody on a tractor all day, every day, putting out hay, guess what? Other things are not getting done, right? Their butt is seated in a tractor, and that means that they can't be doing other things that we really need to have happen on the farm or the ranch. And they're not observing, Clay. I'm sorry, but you cannot make adequate observations when you're running a piece of machinery. You just can't. And nobody can convince me that you can, okay? Because I've sat in that machinery as well, way too many years, and you're not. So we're failing to do our job, to be quite honest with you, you know, when that occurs. So now, that being said, now we'll transition to epigenetics, and let me use this example here. I think would be a great lead into that. So a couple of weeks ago, we had a University School of Veterinary Medicine come out to the farm in Alabama to do a farm tour. Okay, so we had several of the veterinary faculty, and they were bringing third and fourth year, you know, clinical rotation students with them. So we had all of these third and fourth year large animal clinical rotation students, as well as the faculty there. And they wanted to see all of the different enterprises, the cattle and the chickens and the sheep and the pigs and so forth. And we took them out to the cattle first, and we just happened to take them. Our main mob just happened to be, you know, at one particular part of the farm on that day. Gabe, you'll know where I'm talking about, the big lake, okay? And around the big lake, it's a very recently constructed lake, just 3 years ago that we finished construction, and it's a 100-acre lake. So we ran 350 horsepower tractors with big pans digging that sucker out for 2 years, you know, so that land was absolutely beat up, you know, and it was just a lot of bare dirt, you know, after all the construction for the lake, and heavily compacted. We planted nothing there. We have just simply utilized the cattle since then to be able to, you know, repair, rebuild, restore, and build diversity and forage production. So we happened to have the main mob grazing there, and we took this veterinary school group in there. And honestly, it's still one of our very worst pastures right now, because it's just 3 years removed from the construction. And one of the first comments that all of this group of veterinarians and veterinary students made was, "Wow, this is a bunch of grass." And we were like, "No, this is our worst pasture." And they said, "Well, every other farm that we've been on this spring doesn't have near this amount of grass." Yeah. And so I asked them to look around, you know, and to tell me, we had a people mover, you know, our people wagon. I made them get off, and I said, "Walk around, and I want you to identify for me, you know, as many different plant species as you can count out here." And as they were doing that, I asked for a show of hands. I said, "So how many of you, you're all going to be veterinarians, how many of you have ever had a botany or plant ID course?" Only one of them raised their hands. Only one. And so I then asked, I said, "So do you not think that different plants contribute different types of nutrition to livestock?" And they said, yeah. And I said, "And are certain plants maybe medicinal in nature?" And they said, yes. And then I said, are certain plants potentially toxic if they consume too much of it? And they said, yes. And I said, but you've never taken courses to identify these plants. and they said, well, no. And so immediately I showed them an app on the phone. I said, look, you're all going to be veterinarians. Put this app on your phone. You need to know this. But then I asked them, I said, so do you think that maybe enhanced diversity out here of plant species can impact epigenetics of these livestock? And I'll give you a quick and dirty definition of epigenetics. Epigenetics is the influence on environmental factors on degree of expression of genes in an organism. So basically what that means is think of a light switch on the wall with a dimmer on that light switch, right? I can leave the dimmer alone and I can turn the light either all the way off or all the way on. Or I can take the dimmer switch and I can alter the degree of light that is shining, either from full light down to very dim light, right? Our genes work the same way. Gene expression works the same way in any organism for any pair of genes. Those genes can express themselves anywhere from 0 to 100% or anywhere in between. And epigenetics is what determines that, bottom line, okay? The degree of expression of a pair of genes in an organism for all gene pairs. So epigenetics plays a critical role in how well our livestock function, how healthy they are over lifetime, even the longevity, the fertility, all of these important economic factors. So I kept relating back to this group of veterinary students. How does the way we manage influence epigenetics? And we were calving, okay? So, we calve much later than most people do in our part of the world. And so I asked them, I said, what stage of lactation are our cows in? And they thought for a little while and said, well, from the looks of the calves, peak lactation. I said, yes. So what condition? Look across our cow herd here. What is their body condition? And they looked at them and they said, well, that one's a 5.5, that one's a 6, that one's a 7, and so forth. And I said, well, most herds that you look at where the cows are in peak lactation, what is their average body condition? And they said, oh, much lower than this. They're 3s or 4s. And I said, so do you think epigenetics is playing a role here? And they thought for a little while and said, well, I guess so. And I said, well, why? I said, what are the factors? We're calving when we have peak forage production. So they're getting this incredible array of phytonutrients in their diet every day. And that is epigenetically influencing not only the cows, but those calves that are by those cows' side, right? And then they ask us, well, what kind of supplementation are these cows getting? We see you've got your bulls out, so you must be supplementing with something and make sure they had a good breed up. And I turned to, one of our guys there that manages the cattle on a daily basis. His name is Christian. And I said, Christian, would you please tell them what you're supplementing these cattle with? And Christian laughed and said, well, nothing. And they said, really? And then I said, well, how much do you think we fed them during the winter? And they said, well, I don't know. You must have fed a good bit during the winter. We had a pretty bad winter this past year. And I said, Christian, how much did we feed them? And he said, nothing. And then they asked, how much hay did you feed them? And again, Christian said, none. They grazed through the whole winter. Not a bale of hay was fed to this group of cows all winter. And at every point in that conversation, I kept going back to epigenetics. How, if they're grazing all winter versus us hauling hay out all winter, how is that influencing epigenetics, positively or negatively? And then I asked them, because they're veterinary students, I said, so how do you think ultimately positive epigenetic influences are impacting herd health. And again, they looked at each other, thought for a while, and said, well, I guess it's got to be pretty positive. And I said, absolutely. And so my ultimate question to them was then, as a veterinarian, do you think it is more important to diagnose and treat or to help clients prevent? And, they really couldn't answer it any other way. They knew they couldn't. And they said, well, to help prevent. And I said, that is precisely right. I said, the honest truth is, guys and girls, that if all you're doing is thinking about diagnosing and treating, as a rancher, you are of no use to me. And I said, and if that's what's occurring, what do you think is going to be happening epigenetically? And they said, well, that's probably going to negatively impact epigenetics. I said, precisely.
How many times do you anticipate the university coming back?
Clay, I actually thought about that because I mean, honestly, we challenged them hard. And I even challenged the veterinary faculty hard, on all of these points. And I thought that precise thing when they left that day. Will I ever have another group of School of Veterinary Medical students show back up out here? Gabe?
Clay, I just want to spin off of what Ellen said a little bit. And the importance, I hope people grasp it, what he said, how Christian was asked how much hay was fed all the winter, none. Well, up here in the Northern Plains, I mentioned a year ago, we were down to 18 days of feeding hay. It's epigenetics that allow our animals to have the fleshing ability and the ability to convert those lower quality forages and to be able to survive on that. If ranchers want to positively influence their bottom line, they need to focus on epigenetics. If you could imagine in your mind what it must have been like, hundreds of years ago with the herds of bison roaming the Northern Plains. Okay, did those bison get thinner during the winter? Now, obviously they migrated some, but yes, they obviously did. Okay, yet look what happened. Ellen mentioned it. They were calving at peak forage production, animal will cycle earlier, an animal that is gaining weight or a fat animal. Okay, it's the animal gaining weight. If you were to come and look at our cow herd, 1st of April, when we're just weaning calves that are approximately 9.5, 10 months old, they're pretty thin cows. They're going to be body condition score 3.5 or 4. Okay. We start calving May 15th. You wouldn't recognize that cow herd in that 45 days later. They blow up like ticks. Why? Because they have the epigenetics to be able to convert that forage. And I think that's key for profitability. Too many ranchers are solely concerned with what the feedlot wants, what the packer wants. Okay, I'm sorry, but I would much rather have a cow herd that is adapted to my environment and my ranch. They're going to make you way more money than focusing on what the feedlot or packer wants. And I hear way too many people saying, but they won't buy your calf. Bull, they won't. They'll pay top dollar for your calves. We see that over and over again. So I just wanted to make that point.
I think that what we do when we supplement, when we feed, when we do replacement feeding rather than supplemental feeding, I think what we do is we tell our cows, you don't live where you live. And so we shut down epigenetic expression. And then also on top of that, the compounding and cascading effects that we like to talk about is that those cows think, I don't live where I live, so I can get bigger than I would be otherwise. And then they become more in need of future supplementation. And I also think the opposite is true. If you take away that supplementation, especially on the replacement heifer development side, those animals will be a lot smaller than their mothers. They don't put on the frame that they would otherwise. And, we can talk about all the things that go along with that. We shut down long bone growth in the, in the front end because those sex hormones start to produce in those cows, and, they become a different animal than their mother, I think. And it doesn't take generations and generations. It takes, I think you can do it in one, honestly, if you just take away those supplements from those replacement heifers and then expose them for a short period of time and find out who's really fertile. And you would be surprised how quickly that can happen. Am I treading on thin ice here, Alan?
No, I mean that, there's a lot of fact to that. And, and when we look at, if we need to frame our cattle down, it's really pretty simple. Frame score and mature body weight are what we call additive genetic variants, and the offspring are going to typically tend to be the average of the two parents. So if we have frame score 5 and 6 cattle, for instance, and we want to take them down to a 4, you're never going to do that if you're still using frame 5 bulls. It's just not going to happen. So, if I've got frame 5 cows and I want to take them to an average of frame 4, I've got to think about using, at least initially, frame score 3 bulls to be able to get that accomplished in those offspring. But one point I want to really drive home here, Clay, is the very substantial economic and financial benefits of positive epigenetics. When we think about the ability of those cows to survive and thrive, as Gabe has described in his environment, and I have described in mine, then just think about all the things we did not do. We didn't have to put up all of that hay to then not feed all winter. So there's a lot less haymaking in the summertime, and that's not just the financial benefit is not just that we didn't make hay and we didn't run those tractors to make that hay for the winter, but it's also the fact that we reallocated that same labor, to doing something that was far more beneficial to us. And then again, the same thing in the wintertime. When all we're doing in the wintertime is the same thing we're doing in the active grazing season, and we're just moving a poly wire, and the cattle are moving themselves from paddock to paddock to graze stockpile, and we're not cranking machinery to go out there and place bales and feed bales and all of those types of things, then that's, again, a substantial savings. And again, not just the direct savings of not cranking that piece of equipment, but also the reallocation of labor to doing other things that are far more beneficial to us economically on the farm. So, and as we continue to implement those types of practices and reduce that reliance on those inputs, then we continue to see one of the things, Clay, is we do not know what the limit of epigenetics is. Okay. Just like we don't know what the limit of the soil biology is. So as far as we know, we can continuously improve epigenetics in our livestock if we continue to implement practices like this.
Very good. And this might sound like two separate discussions, but really it's one discussion, right? Because we're managing wholes. We're not managing siloed resources. Our plants and our diversity on the landscape plays a critical role in how those epigenetics express themselves and all those kinds of things. So I think it's important for us to make that connection as well. And as we point towards wrapping up here, I wanted, if it's okay, I wanted to talk a little bit about plant succession, and I think that's a connected discussion to this idea of how diversity plays a role in soil aggregation and vice versa.
Yeah, I'll speak to it from my standpoint and ask Gabe to do the same. Earlier we had an extended conversation about building soil aggregate. Without that happening first, it's going to be almost impossible to build high levels of plant species diversity. And here's why. Over the decades and decades, and even in some areas in the U.S., literally centuries of agricultural impact, we have buried and trapped, a lot of this seed bank in multiple compacted layers in the soil. And if they're in that plated layer of soil, they don't have the air, the water, and everything that they need to be able to, germinate and to respond. They're trapped. So the only way to release that seed is to build aggregate down to it. And that includes size of aggregate. So we want to build big aggregates, so we have big pore spaces, and we want to build depth of aggregate. Now, what we have seen in our country over and over again, including on our own farms, is that as we build aggregate deeper into that soil, we see a clear succession of species occurring. We see some species respond in year one, as we build aggregate in the first few inches. And then as we build it deeper, we see a second successionary wave of native plants starting to respond. And as we build it through that third profile depth, we see yet a third successionary wave. And that has continued to happen for us. We now, I've documented more than 155 different plant species. And every year we're continuing to add others, but it's only as we build the depth of the aggregate and the size of the aggregate down to those areas. And how does the aggregate work to do that? Well, seed has to have a way to travel up from deeper into the soil to near the surface to germinate. And there's a multiplicity of ways that happens. One is, as you have highly aggregated soil, you have more biological activity in the soil from macroorganisms, earthworms and beetles and other things that help to move seed up. A third way is under higher stock density impact. We are literally pulsing through the higher stock density impact, all of that hoof action on this aggregated soil. We are pulsing seed up through that pore space as well. So all of those factors work for us to help us create those successionary waves. And here's the other thing that we have to be cognizant about with successionary waves is that never trap yourself into the mindset that whatever is growing this year is what I want it to remain at from that point forward. If you do that, you're going to start limiting yourself and limiting diversity. So you've got to be willing to accept the succession and realize that's a part that's been happening for millennia. And we actually want that to happen. And we want to see different species dominating in different years and different proportions. Gabe?
Yeah, very good, Alan. I'll just add a little bit on that. Alan Savory once made the comment that the minute we as humans consider a plant good or bad, we've lost the battle. And I really believe that. I will use this as an example. So many in the Northern Plains are familiar with absinthe wormwood. It's considered either a restricted or prohibited noxious weed up here. Well, our cattle eat absinthe wormwood just fine. And they will actually seek it out at certain points in time. Why? Because it's an extremely deep-rooted plant. And it's bringing nutrients from deeper into the soil profile. So that diversity Alan talks about is important. Now, I want to talk a little bit from a succession standpoint, Clay, how think of the grazing that we're seeing across many areas, and it's actually globally. We're seeing overgrazing, understocking, overgrazing. What that's actually doing, that is encouraging more annual plants, not only shallower rooted plants, but also encouraging more annuals to germinate. Annuals typically have a much shallower root system, okay? They're nature's way of healing, saying that, hey, this land has been overgrazed. We need to produce biomass quickly, and annual will do that. But what is the negative compounding effects of that? Yes, it provides a positive in that it produces some biomass, But with that shallow root system, we're not able to build those aggregates to depth to access those other layers of that latent seed bank that Alan talked about. That's the reason we need to get into longer recovery times and rest periods, is so we can build those deeper rooted plants, to build both resiliency and to access those latent seeds that are deeper in the soil profile.
Yeah, very, very good. Really appreciate this. Really appreciate the time today from both of you gentlemen. And I think we've probably just scratched the surface here, obviously. But I would like to give people a direction to go as far as continuing education and some of those things. Could you talk to me about some of the resources that you have that would help with some moving people further along the road as far as these discussions are concerned?
Absolutely. So first and foremost, they can go to our understandingag.com website. We have literally reams of articles there on the website, and we're constantly, posting new articles there, new material. We also have lots of podcasts, links to podcasts, such as this one, and webinars, archived webinars. We have case studies that are very pertinent to many people. And then we have online courses. So we have Regen Ag 101. We have an adaptive grazing online course that's available. And then they can go to our soilhealthacademy.org website. And we have, the multi-day hands-on academies. And we encourage people to start, with the online courses and all of the other resources that are on the Understanding Ag website to start the learning process. But the honest truth is, Clay, for them to really get a full grasp of how to do this and how to apply it within their specific context, it's really important that they attend an academy. Because that gives them that multi-day immersive experience that allows them to be able to really fully envision and grasp, what they need to do, how to properly implement the 6 principles, the 3 rules to optimize the 4 ecosystem processes. But the other thing that an academy does for them is that it exposes them to many other farmers and ranchers that are also, in the same learning process. So we work hard to make sure they network and establish those new friendships, that new peer-to-peer network, that they can continue to learn from each other and glean from each other as they go forward. And obviously, we also continue to serve as mentors to them as they move forward.
Yeah, very good stuff. And I think, as always in these conversations, I think it's definitely beneficial to go to one in your own neighborhood, but I think it's also very beneficial to go to one way outside your neighborhood and just see some different country and different management and the way that it works in different places. And there's things to be learned for our zip code from those places too. So, gentlemen, if there isn't anything else that needed to be said today with regard to these things, I will just say to both of you, thank you for your time today.
Well, thank you, Clay. Great to be with you.
Exactly. Thanks, Clay.
Very good stuff there. As always, very practical. Really appreciate the two of them and taking the opportunity to share their wisdom and their experience, and continue to enjoy this opportunity to capture some bonus content with them. Coming up next on the Working Cows podcast, we'll have an episode with Jeff Pribino. Now, Jeff is the father of Logan Pribino. Logan's been a guest a few times on the Working Cows podcast and recently was a guest on Ranching Reboot with Brian Alexander. I encourage you to go check that out. 2 of those guys together talking ranching, and from a big picture perspective, I think can't help but be a good conversation to check out. So, but we're going to talk to Jeff kind of about his family's history and how they got started, but then how they've kept the ranch in the family and some of the things that they've done over the years and throughout the generations to continue to transition that operation to the next generation. So really looking forward to sharing this conversation with you. It was fun to go there and see the wine glass operation in person and to get to sit down with Jeff in his office and record the episode live. So that will be coming your way real soon on another episode of the Working Cows podcast. We'll see you then.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.